Okay, today we're going to do something a little different. I'm actually going to reference my book today, and what we're going to look at is we're going to look at an irrigation system, an overhead irrigation system. I'm going to go to the plot and I'm going to show you guys exactly what's in this book. So if you have my book and you go to chapter 25, which is page 123, you skip up to page 128, we are going to go and look at this exact irrigation system. I'm going to go check it out. We're going to look at how the irrigation flows. We'll look at the different zones so you can follow along. And if you want all the exact materials of this system we're going to look at, it's all in here on page 129. So we're going to check that out. That's coming up next on The Urban Farmer. Okay, here we are at our Lawrence Avenue plot again. This plot is that exact map that is in the book. And one thing that's going to be slightly different from what is actually here and what's in that book is that this irrigation system also has these two greenhouses on drip, and it also has two zones that water the front lawn. And we're not going to get into that because that's not really important for our context. What's important for us is this block here, this high rotation block. So this is effectively a 50 by 50 block. Actually, I think it might be 40 by 50. It's a little bit shorter here, but it's essentially a block in the sense that all these zones are reaching one another. So the thing that's important to point out on a system like this is that you need to have head-to-head coverage. So that means that every head on this zone, so here's one impact here, impact head here. This impact head needs to reach the next one and the next one over here. So this one here will reach all the way to this one. And so they have to cross over. If you don't have exact head-to-head coverage, you're going to get uneven irrigation points because there's going to be double the water being covered at the points where they intersect and less water at the points where they don't intersect. So most overhead irrigation runs head-to-head. This site, we're using what's called impact heads, and again, all this is in the book, all the exact parts, but just to give you a quick breakdown of how these work is these posts are dug 2 feet into the ground, buried in with rocks and sand, and they're just basic impact heads. You can find these at pretty much any irrigation store, and I just cut 2x4s. They've got a treatment on the bottom so they don't rot in the ground. And then they're just built out of basic materials. All this stuff is 3/4 inch poly tubing, and we're using just basic stuff. We've got hose clamps with a coupler that connects the impact head to the main riser, and it's all just done with really simple stuff. Steel strapping to attach it to the post, and it's all tubing. Like, I'm not actually using real risers. I'm just making the risers myself out of tubing because it's cheaper. So this system is pretty inexpensive to build, and if you're going to irrigate a block, just a standard block, this is what you would do. So there's 5 zones on this system. I only have enough pressure, water pressure, to run 2 heads at a time. So I group the heads according to the angle at which they spray, because if you don't, say you had one of the corner pieces grouped with one of the middle pieces, this middle piece is spraying at 180 degrees and that piece is spraying at 90 degrees. That's its angle of approach. If they were to run on the same zone and they ran for 10 minutes, this part that's running 180 degrees would be dumping down half the amount of water than this would. So it's important to group them in this context at the same angles. So these zones are going to be grouped like this. So here's a middle sprinkler. This one's running at 180 degrees. I want to group it with another sprinkler that runs 180 degrees. So it's going to be that one, because my line from my irrigation box, and we'll look at that in a minute, will run to this sprinkler here. And on the bottom of it, there's going to be a T-coupler. Right, so the water comes to that sprinkler, goes up to that sprinkler, and then carries on to the next one. So the that hose or that line is going to pass by this head and go over to this head. So they'll be on the same zone. So you can, the times that you set your irrigation is arbitrary. It's whatever works for your soil and your climate and your crop. So let's just say, for example, that my corner pieces are at 10 minutes. So if my corner pieces run at 90 degrees, right, they run at a 90-degree pattern, my 180 degree sprinklers, I want to run at double that because they're covering twice the amount of area. So that's 90 degrees at 10 minutes. This is 180 degrees, so that's going to be at 20 minutes. And the other sprinkler type here, so we've got a 90 on the corners, 180s on the side. The anomalous one is the 360 degree sprinkler in the center, and that's going to be on its own zone entirely. And 360 degrees is 4 times 90. So with that thinking, I would put this one at 40 minutes because it's 4 times what a 90 degree is, or double what a 180 degree is. So there's 3 different types of zones here, but there's 5 zones altogether. So let's break that down. So this is my irrigation box. This thing is basically just to keep the sun off the timers, or the weather from off the timers. So I don't own this plot of land, right? So I'm not going to put in any type of permanent infrastructure, whether it be burying lines or things that I can't take with me if and when I leave. I have a 5-year lease on this place, and hopefully we'll have another 5-year lease. So there are some things I'll show you up here that I have put in that are in a way permanent because I had to do them just to get water here. I'll explain that in a minute. But first, let's look at this timer. So take this cover off, and I've got these are Home Depot style timers. They're just 4-zone timers by Orbit. I think they cost around $80 each. And when you buy them, they come with 2 zones, so you have to buy an extra 2 valves to put on there. And we will fire them up in a minute and show you which zones they water, but first I'll just explain more of this thing. Okay, so don't really pay attention to the fact that there's 2 sets of timers here. Well, there's 3 zones that we're not going to look at because those zones, these 3 zones here, are watering the greenhouse and the front lawn. So that's not really important for the system for a farm. That's just stuff that's specific to this site. So we're going to ignore that. What we're going to look at is this zone here, which is zone 4 of this one timer, and then we're going to look at these 4 zones, 1 through 4 of this timer, because these are the timers that water this plot. So this zone, let's just call this one zone 5, and that's going to water the center sprinkler, and then these other 4 zones are going to water either the groupings of the 2 90s, or there's going to be 4 90 degrees sprinklers that are run on 2 zones, and then there's 4 180 degrees that are running off these 2. The main in is PVC, which there's constant pressure on this here. This comes to a manifold that splits up to these timers. And keep in mind, this is pretty do-it-yourself stuff. I'm sure there's better ways to do this, and there's many other ways to do it, but this is just what has worked for me. This is a filter. So from the main water that comes off the city water, I'll show you that in a minute, we have a filter in there. We don't have a pressure reducer because we don't need one. If we were doing drip, we would, and if you notice, my drip here does have a pressure reducer, but we're not going to look at that one today. We're just going to look at the overhead. So basically what I'll do is I'll fire up all of these zones and show you how each of them run. But first I'll show you the front. First I'll show you guys how the water comes onto this plot in the first place, because this plot is a little bit anomalous in the sense that it doesn't have a home on it, so I can't just plug into the tap what I normally do. So here I had to set this up like I would a house actually, and I had to put in this big concrete well that has the city water coming in from the main line, so I pay the utility on this. And we've got a pretty complicated rig, and I can't really explain to you how all that works. I got a plumber to do this for me. You know, he had to get a permit to do it and everything. So I've got my main that comes off near the street that comes down here, so it's frost protected. There's a water meter on there. And then basically that is a PVC line we've run up here that comes around to my timer. And you might ask, why don't I just have all the timers here? Well, I have in the past, and it was a bit of an eyesore, and it got in the way, whereas back there it's out of the way and isn't seen by the neighbors as much, so we felt that it was more appropriate to have it back there. So this is where my water comes from. Okay, so let's fire this thing up. We'll start with zone 1, which is going to be the center head, and that's going to run 360 degrees at 4 times the amount of time that the sprinklers on 90 degrees would run. Okay, now we'll run zone 2, which is going to be the 2 90-degree sprinklers on the further side of the plot. So one straight close to the greenhouse there, and then the other one on the opposite corner over there. Okay, now we'll run zone 3, which is the center sprinkler at 180 degrees there, and the center one at 180 degrees over there. Okay, zone 4 is this guy here, 90, and the other one at the opposite corner there. And zone 5 is the 180 degree sprinklers in the center right here and on the opposite side over there. So notice when this is running that you can see each sprinkler is reaching to the other sprinkler and perhaps a little bit further. That's really important to understand, that if you don't have covered or edge to edge or head to head, that you're going to get uneven watering. Okay, I'll just explain how these heads work. So there's 1, 2, 3 things that you can adjust on these heads. These down below here, those change the angle of approach. So I've got it set to 90, so it goes like this. The second thing you can change is on the top here, is this little piece. That will direct the height of the spray. And then the third thing is this little pin that gets in the way, it interrupts the spray. And so by changing that, you make a more coarse or a finer spray. And that is effective when I want to set these sprinklers so that I don't get too much splash, because what can happen is if you have too coarse of a spray, you'll be splashing up too much dirt onto your greens, and my objective is always to try to keep the greens as clean as possible. That means we don't have to wash them as much, sometimes not at all. Now that we're selling to grocery stores, we actually wash our greens all the time, but for quite a period of time we weren't having to wash our greens at all, because we were just selling to restaurants that would wash them anyways, and at the farmers market where we would tell our customers they don't wash them, and this is why, because they keep longer. But anyways, that's another subject altogether. So changing the density of the spray will affect how much dirt you have kicking up onto the greens. So whenever I set up a system, I'll run a zone and I'll stand here and I'll make micro adjustments. Well, that is the system. If you guys have found that helpful, hit the subscribe button right now, like and share these videos with your friends. And again, all of this is described in more detail in my book. You can get my book if you're in the US or Canada at theurbanfarmer.co. And more of this information is in my online course as well. I've put up videos in there for quite a while about these, and there's other systems in there as well. But if you guys have questions or comments, please leave them below. And if you'd like to make a donation to the show, it's much appreciated and always welcome. You can do that at theurbanfarmer.co/support. Okay, thanks for watching.